The housing market crash of 2008 was a devastating blow to the economy of the United States, and yet not many young people today even know about it or even know that it happened. This is a graph by the University of Utah. I can pull it up here. You can see here, to adjust the brightness. This is a graph by the University of Utah showing the state of the housing market. We'll be specifically looking from 2002, if you can see on there, to 2008. On the y-axis, there are the prices that represent the prices of homes for a single-family home. On the x-axis, we have the years. As you can see, from 2002 to 2006, there's an increase in the prices of these homes. So from here to here, there's an obvious increase. Good for the banks, but bad for the people with mortgages and poor potential home buyers, as the price is increasing. You don't want to pay high for a home. Then from 2006 to 2007, there is a price reduction of about $10,000 from here to here, that little slant there. No biggie, the bank's lot, just a minor hiccup. Then, oh my God, from 2007 to 2008, as you can see here to here, there's about a $30,000 drop. And this caught the banks really, that caught their attention really quickly. But it was too late. The housing market had busted completely, and the only thing they could do was watch. The only real person that could help them was the government, and they had to eventually bail them out. I will get into that. But as you can see from here to here, increase, and then $10,000 decrease, and then a $30,000 decrease in a year. So the banks essentially were blind to this, and I will get more into that. So going to the next slide is some vocabulary to teach, to inform some people in. Now, businesses and banks use vocabulary that is very kind of hard to understand unless you're in the world of finance and all about numbers and stuff. They don't essentially use it to confuse people, but it does who are not familiar with the terminology that they use. So we'll start with mortgage. Mortgage is when people someone takes a loan from a bank and they put up their house as collateral. If they cannot pay it off monthly, a portion of the mortgage, the bank will take the home, which leads to default, which is essentially when someone cannot pay the monthly fee that they are supposed to pay on their mortgage. They default, or it's called a default on their mortgage. And the third vocabulary term that we're going to use, as you can see here, is subprime mortgage. Now, a subprime mortgage is mortgage filled up with B's, first tier B's, double B's, not triple B's, but maybe even C's. I will get more into that in a different slide, on the Jenga slide that I made. But essentially, these are mortgages that people can invest in that are very high risk, but are very, they're high risk, but they yield a high return. But it's essentially like you could put $100 in today, and tomorrow that $100 is just gone, and you can do nothing about it. So that is a subprime mortgage. So how did this happen? And it all started with the banks. If I can find it. The banks got greedy, essentially, and mortgages were on the rise. So mortgage bonds were essentially safer than investing in stocks. Most banks sell off mortgages to make money, and then they sell it off to other banks or third parties. So that's how they turn a profit with people's mortgages. I've heard of some people, they have more, 3 different banks have had their mortgages. So you can essentially see banks selling this piece of paper that is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on how much of a mortgage it is. So investors were then allowed to invest their money into this mortgage in hopes of yielding a safe return. And I will, as I said, I'll get more into that with triple A's, double A's, not batteries, but with mortgage bonds. The real estate industry was booming. Banks were getting fat and happy with money. The prices of homes were rising, and the balloon of the housing market was getting bigger. As you remember from that graph I showed you from the second slide, you could see that big increase from 2002 to 2006, going up like a roller coaster. Now here's where things started to go wrong. The banks essentially got pretty greedy. There are more reasons that I will get into. You hear people these days say the only thing you need to invest in stocks are some real estate and just stocks. And you mean really? Just real estate and stocks? It is 2020 and we have repeated history essentially. We are currently in a recession with COVID-19 going on. The housing market is essentially following the same pattern, not as drastically, but following the same pattern. I won't be going into that. I'll be sticking to 2008. So essentially, do your research before investing your money into anything. Do not blindly throw your money, as they did in this time. People were not researching; they were just being essentially lied to. So the banks were lending people mortgages who did not even qualify for a mortgage. These people had low income, they had low FICO scores or credit scores. I heard around 550 was not an average, but like a normal, which is really bad, and I have a chart on here that I will be showing of credit scores. Or they couldn't handle even a down payment. And the banks, essentially, they didn't care. They were getting richer, default rates began to rise. As I said before, default is when people couldn't pay on their mortgages, the monthly pay dates. So defaults began to rise from about 1% to 4%. And people couldn't handle what the banks were throwing at them. They began losing their homes. But the problem began to snowball even more out of control. Now, we're going to go to the slide with the FICO score. So just an FYI, for college students who are looking into getting into buying houses, or even just building a good credit score, this is where you need to start. Now, this little arrow here, if you can see that, that is pointing to around 570. This is from 300 to 579. Now, when I mentioned before that people were in the 550 scores and the banks were still loaning them, they were around here. You can see on there. It just goes to show how greedy the banks were getting and how much they were overlooking things and caring less and less and less. So essentially, build a good credit score, get good loans, and pay attention to where your money goes. Now I'm going to get into the Jenga tower of mortgage bonds. So mortgage bonds were made of Bs, double Bs, triple Bs, As, double As, and triple As. Triple A's being the highest in security for investors. They were fairly secure. They didn't yield a big return, but you had that safety net there holding you up. If you did lose some money, it wasn't everything. Bs were way riskier to invest in. There could be serious cash to earn in, but you could lose essentially everything. So if you lost this, you lost everything and up above. And this is essentially, if you've seen The Big Short, they explain it very well, and this is why I included this in my slide. If one of these goes, all of these go, and that is the entire housing market crash of 2008. This represents the housing market crash, and it just completely toppled. One goes, all of it goes. So going down more. So who's to blame for the housing market crash? Essentially, it was the rating agencies, the government, and banks. They overlooked the horrible bonds that were becoming. Maybe they didn't see it, and maybe they did. Rating agencies gave subprime mortgages, there's that word again, the rating of AAA, because they were put into CDOs, or a collateralized debt obligation. Now, collateralized debt obligation were groups of these mortgage bonds that the banks didn't want to get rid of, so they took all the low-level B bonds and they put them together with other bonds, and they called them a CDO, and they basically pretended like it was something new and better. People were none the wiser about it, and according to the Berkeley, the University of California, in 2018, the government simply downplayed the whole thing. They just simply shrugged their shoulders and didn't realize that the housing market was going to burst. Wall Street made lots of money off the banks, which eventually didn't matter as the stock market crashed. And everyone lost everything. It was like a roller coaster, essentially. You're going up and up and up until you get to the top. And you get to that hump. If you remember, I'm going to go back to the graph, of 2006 was when the peak rised. And then 2007, you hit that little jut. And then everyone thinks, oh, that's when you're going down, but there's an even bigger slope to go down. The banks didn't see this. They had their eyes shut for half of the ride, and when they finally did eventually open their eyes, they were halfway down the drop before realizing it, and they lost money and they essentially failed. Banks went bankrupt and out of business. They were either merged with other banks or they got bailed out by the government. The stock market crashed and the housing market had finally busted. And so now what? People asked. You're now homeless because the bank took your home. And now the banks are gone. And it probably felt like the end of the world for a lot of people, unfortunately. It was a horrible time to be an investor. So how did we come back from this? Did we really come back from this? Personally, I don't believe so. The numbers say we don't. Millions of people were affected by this, and they still are. A good portion of them were out of jobs. About 15% of African Americans were, and 12% of Hispanics were out of jobs, according to Berkeley. There are still people trying to recover today, even. It was only 12 years ago, and it ended essentially around 2010. Again, back to that graph from up the top. It only ended around 2010. If you can see here, down at that bottom, and then it came back up. So back down. Oh, I'm sorry. I accidentally clicked something. There. So, and it's happening again as well. Banks are continuing the practice of CDOs, which was taking low-level B bonds and putting them into groups with other bonds and essentially making those low-level bonds look appealing and basically dirtying the other bonds. Their thought process is if they take the risk, they get the tons of money, and even if they fail, the government will still bail them out. And this is just morally wrong. They are affecting millions of people with their decisions. So if there is a lesson to take away from this, it is to research where you put your money first before you actually invest your money. Thank you.